Edward Theodore Gein, better known to history as the Butcher of Plainfield, was one of the most grotesque figures in American criminal history. His is a grim tale of murder, grave robbing, and other macabre obsessions, astonishing the nation and leaving an indelible mark upon popular culture. The crimes of Gein were so grossly weird that they became the stuff of nightmares and spawned some of the most iconic characters in horror fiction. The background, psychological driving forces, and shocking discoveries in the life and crimes of Ed Gein are what constitute his horror tale. Distressing childhood, the making of a monster. Ed Gein was born in La Crosse, Wisconsin on August 27, 1906, to George and Augusta Gein. From the very start of his life, Ed's course was set upon a toxic family environment headed by his mother. Augusta Gein was a very religious woman with many fanatic views. She preached extreme values about sin and morale, particularly with regard to women, whom she considered to be minions of the devil. Augusta ruled Ed and his older brother Henry with an iron fist, attempting to insulate the boys from the corrupting influence of the outside world. George Gein, Ed's father, was an alcoholic who only intermittently provided for the family. He was pretty well absent from Ed's life, both physically and emotionally, and his presence only seemed to perpetuate Augusta's general hostility toward men. The Gein household was one of isolation and repression. Augusta forbade her sons from making friends or associations outside the family circle, and she continually indoctrinated into them the evils of the world, in particular the perils presented by women. Ed had been a shy and introverted child, with a close, almost unnatural attachment to his mother, anxious to please. He was a very antisocial and lonely boy, often tortured at school because of his strange behavior and lack of social skills. His only salvation was his mother, who gave him attention and affection, but in a very twisted and controlling manner. Ed's relationship with Augusta was highly abusive and seriously dysfunctional. She had been the only woman he ever really knew, and her lessons certainly left him with a very distorted view regarding sex, women, and morality. Since he was a young boy, Ed got punished when he showed interest in girls, and Augusta made it worse by reinforcing this idea that all sexual desire was, in fact, sinful. She read to the boys from the Bible, especially the parts about God's wrath and punishment of the bad guys. The unrelenting religious indoctrination, along with Augusta's autocratic parenting, seared Ed's worldview and locked down any emotional development. In 1914, the Gein family moved to a farm outside Plainfield, Wisconsin. That move severed any ties the Geins may have had with society. Their farm sat well in among dense woods, far from any neighbors. It gave Augusta even more reason and opportunity to begin developing more rigid control over her sons, alienating them further from the outside world. As Ed grew older, it seemed the more attached to his mother he was getting. The only one giving love and approval to him was Augusta, and he kept becoming clingier. That was even more stressed after the death of George Gein in 1940, at which time he was completely at the mercy of Augusta's whims, and the world shrunk further and became minuscule. The Death of Augusta. Until 1945, the year when Augusta had a series of strokes that rendered her frail and helpless, Ed Gein's life took a different twist. Ed dedicated himself to caring for Augusta. However, her deteriorating health kept crumbling. On December 29, 1945, Augusta died, and Ed Gein was deeply traumatized by this tragedy. She was his everything, the only stability in his life, and now he was all alone. It was with Augusta's death that Ed Gein started his journey into madness. Her guiding hand having been removed, he was not well equipped to deal with the loneliness and isolation now reigning supreme in his life. The farmhouse, an ordered and disciplined domain under Augusta's undisputed rule, now slowly transformed into a chaotic and disturbing mirror of Ed's failing mental state. He shut off the rooms his mother occupied and left them that way for her memory, and lived in filth and squalor, in just a small area near the kitchen. In the succeeding years following his mother's death, the fixation with death and the female body became an obsession for Ed. His loneliness drove him into books about anatomy, Nazi medical experiments, and cannibalism stories or human experimentation. The morbid fascination fueled an already twisted psyche, molding him toward a path of grotesque and horrifying behavior. Among the aspects of Ed Gein's descent to be considered part of the most disturbing was his compulsion to visit local cemeteries in the dark. He spent several years exhuming bodies of recently buried women who reminded him of his mother. Later on, he argued that he was in a kind of daze during such actions and very seldom could recall what he had done until afterwards. These sprees of grave robbing were motivated by a pathological desire to be reunited with his mother once again, to possess her somehow, even if that possession entailed the grotesque facsimile provided by the bodies of other women. The horrific discoveries at the Gein farmhouse. The day Plainfield, Wisconsin would never forget was November 16, 1957, when the disappearance of hardware store owner Bernice Warden sent the silent town into a tailspin. When Warden's son, Frank, a deputy sheriff, found Ed Gein to be the last one who had seen his mother alive, he immediately grew suspicious. Frank Warden knew full well the odd behavior and reputation that Gein carried as a loner and quickly notified authorities, sending them on their way to search Gein's farmhouse. What investigators found inside Ed Gein's home would be etched forever in the annals of American crime history. The farmhouse was squalid, a nightmarish scene full of the stench of decay. But it was the shocking, gruesome artifacts made out of human remains that shocked even seasoned law enforcement officials. Inside the house, police found Bernice Warden's decapitated body hanging upside down in the shed, gutted like a deer. Her head was in a burlap sack, and her heart was in a plastic bag near the stove. The pure brutality of the murder was astonishing to say the least, but far from the beginning of horrors that were found. As they combed through the farmhouse, a team of investigators discovered an unbelievable array of human remains. Bowls made from human skulls, lampshades from human skin, a belt made from female nipples, and a collection of noses, lips, and fingertips. But of everything else, what perhaps disturbed them most was the finding of a skin suit, basically. A suit made from the tanned hides of women, with a mask made from a human face. These grotesque trophies were the fruits of Gein's grave-robbing activities and his bizarre desire to recreate his mother. Most significant of all was a skin suit. Gein would later confess that he wore the skin suit in some sort of macabre ritual, trying literally to assume the skin of his mother and assume her identity. This was a manifestation of his intense attachment to Augusta and a perverted way of wanting her resurrected. The only words that could describe such an act sent shockwaves across the nation in the extent and depravity of his crimes. Plainfield was a small, quiet community that became the epicenter of a media frenzy when the details of Gein's crimes were made public. The horror of what Ed Gein had done was unimaginable, leaving a lasting scar on the collective consciousness of America. Psychological profile: understanding the monster. The psychological analysis presented was of Ed Gein, a man deeply disturbed, suffering from a combination of severe mental disorders that determined his horrific crimes. Gein was diagnosed with schizophrenia, delusions, hallucinations, disorganized thinking, etc., characterizing the disorder. His schizophrenia was compounded by psychosis, whereby he lost all contact with reality and in which his actions were propelled by a delusional belief system wrapped around his mother. These crimes committed by Gein cannot be taken strictly as having been sexually motivated, to be able to understand the word in its very traditional meaning. He had this pathological urge to recreate his mother and to keep her memory alive. Not coming to terms with his mother's death and his obvious obsession with his mother led him to engage in grave robbing and acts of body desecration viewed as keeping her close. Perhaps the most telling symbol of his psychosis was the skin suit that Gein crafted from the bodies of his victims and the exhumed corpses. It was an attempt at a merger with his mother, to be his mother, and in fact to realize the delusional belief that he could bring his mother back to life. Putting on the skin suit was an act of identity confusion in which Gein could temporarily escape his own fractured self and be someone else, somebody he wished he could be. Gein's actions also captured deep-seated issues related to gender and sexuality. His wish to be a woman, specifically his mother, appeals to a great gender identity disorder. Wearing the skin suit allowed Gein to temporarily remove himself from the torment of his own identity and become the object of his obsession. This kind of behavior would most likely fall under what today's psychiatric field would categorize as body dysmorphic disorder, in which one is utterly preoccupied with one's perceived flaws in physical appearance and embarks on radical means of self-change or bodily adjustment. The skin suit, therefore, was not only a product he received from grave robbing and murder, but also a physical manifestation of his inner turmoil and the distorted view of self. This grotesque creation could allow Gein to become one with the figure he idolized. Fearing this ritualistic transformation spoke to deep psychological disturbances. The impact of Gein's crimes on society and culture. The discoveries about the crimes committed by Ed Gein sent shockwaves into American society. Such horror was impossible to get used to, and it certainly made the nation take a hard look at some of the darker corners of human psychology, questions of insanity, evil, and capability for violence. The case of Gein ranks among the first of those which showed the world the extent to which extreme behavior can emanate from terrible psychological disorders, and his case became the focal point in discussions with regard to the intersection of madness and criminality. The media frenzy that surrounded his case turned Gein into a household name, and his story soon entered popular culture. His appalling acts triggered a new wave of horror fiction. The details of Gein's life were used by writers and filmmakers in creating some of the most fearsome characters in the genre. Norman Bates, the central character of Robert Bloch's 1959 novel Psycho, is arguably the most direct descendant of Ed Gein in popular culture. Like Gein, Bates is a mild-mannered type who clings very close to his mother. A novel that was later adapted into a 1960 film by Alfred Hitchcock did much to explore the psychosis of its killer Bates, in ways much similar to Gein. His case of split personality and dressing himself in his mother's clothes, now long dead, make him a character symbolic of the dangers of psychological trauma left unchecked. Leatherface from Tobe Hooper's 1974 film The Texas Chainsaw Massacre would also be largely inspired by Gein. Like Gein, Leatherface lives in rural isolation and uses items from human remains to decorate his home. The grotesque masks he fashions out of the skins of his victims, and even the use of human bones for household decoration, directly reference the similar artifacts taken from Gein's home. Leatherface's mindless brutality and the macabre aesthetic of his household tap into the very same primal fears that Gein's real-life actions evoked. Another serial killer, Buffalo Bill in Thomas Harris's 1988 novel, The Silence of the Lambs, also draws from his life. In the novel, and its 1991 film adaptation, Buffalo Bill kills women and then skins them in order to fashion a woman suit, behavior directly paralleling Gein's skin suit. In the meantime, the character's fictionalized struggle with his identity and his attempts at changing himself through the mutilation of others show a fictional elaboration of those self-same impulses which Gein had shown to commit those crimes. Beyond these direct portrayals, Gein's story has influenced the larger horror genre. The concept of the killer who hides in plain sight, who lives among us but harbors unspeakable secrets, is a repeated trope within horror fiction. Gein's case was one of the very first to illustrate how monstrous behavior could emanate from those least expected, and that realization has reverberated across scores of horror movies, books, and television series. The trial, legal, and psychological consequences arising. A decade later, in 1968, Ed Gein was declared competent to be put on trial for the committing of his heinous crimes. This trial, held in the county of Waushara, Wisconsin, brought a sensation upon the public mind. Overwhelming evidence was found at Gein's farmhouse, and he himself confessed to the crimes. He was charged with first-degree murder in the case of Bernice Worden, though he had also confessed to the murder of Mary Hogan, a tavern owner who disappeared 3 years previously. No action was taken on this charge, possibly because the evidence recently discovered in the case of Worden made for a far stronger and more sensational crime scenario. In defense, Gein's lawyers entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. This was further supported by psychiatric diagnoses of schizophrenia and psychosis. Eventually, Gein was ruled to have indeed murdered but insane at the time of committing the offense. Therefore, Gein did not go to prison. Instead, he was sent to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane, where he spent the rest of his days. The trial and commitment of Gein drove home the futility of the legal system in dealing with a defendant's grave mental illness. His acts fell so far outside the boundaries of human behavior that they undermined all traditional beliefs regarding criminal responsibility and punishment. A commitment to a mental institution, rather than to prison, indicated that his actions were the result of grave disorders of the mind, rather than a premeditated decision to murder. Gein's case also shed light on the treatment of the criminally insane. His years in the hospital were ones in which his violent behavior was greatly diminished. and he was a model patient who did routine duties without any hint of the bizarre or aggressive tendencies that characterized his life before his arrest. This behavior tended to indicate that, at least in a tightly controlled environment, Gein's psychosis could be controlled, even if it could never be cured. Life after trial. Gein spent the rest of his life at the Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison, Wisconsin. The facility allowed for a controlled environment where Gein's psychological health could be consistently monitored and treated. Despite the heinousness of the crimes, it is said that Gein did fairly well at adjusting to life in the hospital. He was quiet and cooperative, usually spending much of his days doing odd jobs and participating in hospital activities. The transformation of Gein from a feared criminal into a compliant patient raises significant questions regarding the nature of mental illness and probable rehabilitation. Whereas in the real world it was quite evident that Gein was seriously disturbed and dangerous, his behavior under controlled conditions of the hospital testifies that such propensity for violence was closely connected with very specific circumstances, such as isolation, attachment to his mother, and inability to survive her loss. With that, Ed Gein died of cancer complications on July 26, 1984, at the age of 77, thus bringing to a close one of the most infamous chapters in American criminal annals. Gein was buried next to his mother in the Plainfield cemetery, in an unmarked grave that has since been the subject of vandalism and theft. A headstone marking his grave was stolen in 2000, reflecting an ongoing fascination with Gein and his crimes. Evil in the light of reflections. The story of Ed Gein provides a rude but necessary awakening to what evil is and the possibility of human beings to do unspeakable horrors. Gein didn't just murder people. He committed his crimes as the product of a deeply disturbed mind shaped by such a toxic upbringing and with profound mental illness. His actions really force one to consider the means society deals with insanity, criminal behavior, and the thin line that separates sanity from madness. The legacy of Gein is complex. On one hand, he was remembered as a monster, a figure of fear whose name has become synonymous with the darker aspects of the human psyche. His crimes so shocked a nation and left such an impact upon the collective psyche that his crimes inspired many a work of horror fiction, making him the icon of that part of our psyche that is capable of great evil. Conversely, Gein's story is also a cautionary tale about how negligence in the name of mental health and withdrawal from society can worsen matters of psychological derangement. Gein was a deeply troubled man, and in another world, he might have received the help he so desperately needed before his thoughts and fantasies turned violent. His case brings to light the need for awareness of and treatment for mental illness before it becomes irreversible. He is one of those figures in popular culture who cannot be underestimated in his impact. His life and crimes seem to have been a touchstone for the horror genre, crossing over into a wide number of characters, stories, and movies. Figures like Norman Bates, Leatherface, and Buffalo Bill, among many others, all stand in testament to Gein's unique brand of horror, rooted as it is in psychological disturbance, rural isolation, and mutilation between the human and the monstrous. Yet the fascination with Gein extends even beyond how he influenced popular culture. His story taps into deep-seated fears about the breakdown of social order, dangers lurking within those who are seemingly ordinary, and the fragility of sanity. Gein's life was a reminder that the capacity for horror was not confined to what was far away or unknown, but might arise from the most familiar and unexpected quarters. A life of horror, a legacy of fear. Ed Gein's existence had been one of seclusion, madness, and unspeakable horror. From the disturbed child at the mercy of his mother's tyrannical rule to the heinous crimes that shocked an entire nation. The story of Ed Gein represents depth in psychological disturbance and the disastrous effects of not treating mental illnesses. His legacy, born out of fear and disgust, also represents a strong reminder of the turmoil of the human brain and the dangers of allowing those points of turmoil to fester unabated. The story of Ed Gein will haunt the American imagination for generations to come. For as long as stories of horror are told, Ed Gein, the butcher of Plainfield, will be remembered in the glasses of humanity as a grim icon showing the evil within. His life and crimes were testimony unto the darkest aspects of the human condition, festered beneath the facade of ordinary normal life. By going deep into the life of Ed Gein, one is forced to grapple uncomfortably with human nature, the madness within us all, and society's ineptitude toward those in most need of help. The story of Gein is layered and multilateral, and has sustained reverberations to this date, not only as a horror story, but also as a testament to darker shades in the human soul. Thank you for spending time with us through Spookscope today. Feel free to share your knowledge and wisdom in the comments section, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share it with your friends and family. Until next time, my dear spooker, stay curious,